our final session this morning, I would like to introduce Dr. Michelle Hamilton, excuse me, full professor of Spanish and Portuguese and director of the Center for Medieval Studies and my beloved alma mater, University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Go Gophers. Dr. Hamilton's research focuses on cultural contacts in medieval Iberia, literary theory and cultural studies, Hebrew and Arabic culture in Europe, and the medieval Mediterranean and its legacy. She's the author of Representing Others in Medieval Iberian Literature, published by Palgrave Macmillan, and has published her work in a host of journals, including La Crónica, Studi Hispanici, the Journal for Medieval Iberian Studies, and Speculum. To close this morning's panel, she will now present on religious allegory in the Libro de Buen Amor, Between Sacred and Iberian History. Professor Hamilton.
Thank you. Does this work? Huddle over. I'll stand up. Wow. Okay. Well, I want to echo some of the thanks to the organizers of the conference. It's been very fun, and also to the other scholars who are here, because I know I'll echo what Emily said. I definitely have used a lot of your scholarship, and thank you. So today I'll be discussing the Libro de Buen Amor, and at the very end I will get to the allegory that I put in the title. The Libro de Buen Amor opens in the Salamanca manuscript, in the Salamanca copy, with allusions to the exodus of the Jews from Egypt and to the Book of Esther. The first line summarized Exodus, the flight of the Jews out of captivity in ancient Egypt, commemorated in the Jewish holiday of Passover. And the second copla up here begins by underscoring the divine favor shown to Esther, the eponymous hero of the biblical book or scroll bearing her name. And some 19th and 20th century scholars have posited this opening as an imitation of the Ordo and the Adventus Anime, a supplication for the soul using biblical narratives of Old Testament figures like Jonah or Daniel or the Jews as an entire pueblo, and Christian saints like Sebastian, but none of them ever include Esther, so I think it's curious that Esther is here at the beginning. Alan Dayerman thinks that this is just a literary evocation of a liturgical prayer, so sort of liturgical-esque, moment for the readers. Jack Walsh notes that we find echoes of these verses in the Libro de Alexandre in Coplas 106 and 107. In this opening, the narrative of the Libro de Buen Amor identifies with the Jews and with the Jewish figure associated with the holiday of Purim, Esther. And the holiday of Purim commemorates the heroic acts of Esther and Mordecai, who worked in the Persian royal court to save the Jews living in Babylon from the machinations of the evil minister Haman and his courtiers. This holiday was, and it still is, celebrated by carnivalesque feasting and drinking, the reading of the biblical text, the Megillat Esther, the scroll or book of Esther, as well as in medieval Spain and Provence, and still today in other diasporic communities, the composition and performance of parodies of contemporary Jewish-Christian relations. Several in the the medieval context in the rhymed prose format of the Hebrew Makama. Barry Dove-Wallfish points out that Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, was, though, for pre-modern Christians, an embarrassment. And I quote, "Most pre-modern Christian exegetes would probably have wished that it had never been included in the canon. The church fathers ignored it completely, and in the Middle Ages it was commented upon very rarely." End quote. However, the text was, veritably speaking, all the rage among 13th and 14th century Spanish and Provençal Jewish communities. Today, I want to focus not only on this important signpost placed in the work's opening lines in the Salamanca manuscript, pointing us, I believe, and I'm sure I'll get comments afterward, not only to contemporary Jewish traditions as integral to an understanding of both the Libro de Buen Amor's content and the ways of reading required by it, but also to how such an approach resonates with the reading of perhaps the most well-known, or one of the most well-known passages of the book, the so-called Battle of Carnal y Quaresma. Notably, another point in the text, when the work's author, Juan Ruiz, whoever he or they may have been, explicitly invokes Jewish beliefs and customs, and members of the contemporary Jewish community. While medieval Christian thinkers mostly ignored Esther, in these opening lines, Juan Ruiz makes a critical move very much in line with contemporary Jewish exegetes and preachers, because there's also preserved Jewish sermons, namely putting himself and us, the readers, with him in the place of Queen Esther. And I'm just going to include Talia Fishman's study on how medieval, she has medieval exegetes, but this is medieval Jewish exegetes, valorized Esther as a model for all Jews, including Jewish men. Right? And Esther was interpreted as the epitome of the clever courtier who understands how a subject should approach a ruler in order to accomplish difficult goals. Right? And she knows how striking the gender-neutral mode in which the medieval rabbis praise Esther's skill as a courtier. Esther and Mordecai's tale in the Persian court and their efforts and success at avoiding the destruction of the Jewish exilic community become exemplary in the diasporic communities of medieval Europe. Wolfe shows that in southern France and Iberia, where Jews participated more frequently in the culture of the court and had recognized positions of power, the tale is interpreted as a roadmap for how to most effectively serve in Gentile or non-Jewish courts and how to maintain relationships with non-Jews. According to Mark Saperstein, the story of Esther is the biblical narrative most reflective of medieval Jewish realities. And I quote, "Its story, set entirely in the diaspora, dealing with the endangered Jewish community and the precarious dynamics of the royal court, was closer to the situation of medieval Jewish life than that of any other biblical book." End quote. Iberian and Provençal Purim parodies include from the 12th century, here's a picture of Esther in front of the king, from the Sarajevo Haggadah. But you have the woman in the court, right, talking to the king and negotiating for the lives of the Jews. Okay, so here we have from the 12th century Purim parodies, so original compositions parodying or using the book of Esther. From the 12th century, Abraham ibn Ezra, Bahia ben Asher, and Shemariah ben Elijah. From the 13th century, we have Purim parodies by Joseph ibn Caspi and Abraham Bedersi. From the 14th century, we have parodies by Gersonides, Solomon Astrup, Yitzhak ben Yosef, Kreskas ibn Kaslari, Yitzhak HaKohen, Kalonimus ben Kalonimus, and Joseph Nahmias, who, I think I included that, wrote a parody in Toledo in the first half of the 14th century. And from the 15th century, you can see up here. I wanted to show it, this was something that was happening. It was very, very common and part of the culture. Let's see, while most of these rhyme, prose, or poetic Purim parodies were composed in Hebrew, some, including those of Ibn Kaslari and Abraham Bedersi, were composed in Romance dialects, Provençal and Catalan. One of the characters in Kalonimus ben Kalonimus's parody advocates for the use of the vernacular for Catalan in the reading of the Megillat Esther, since the vernacular is, and I quote, better understood than Hebrew. And this reflects historical reality, as documented in a letter of 1375 from the Rabbi of Zaragoza to his former teacher in Barcelona, claiming that for the past 30 years, and he says, Spanish translation of the Megillah was read to the women during Purim. The two Purim parodies, Sefer Habakuk HaNavi and Megillat Setarim, composed by a contemporary of Juan Ruiz, Gersonides, both date to the early 1330s and reflect the carnivalesque aspects of the Purim celebrations of Provence. These works feature exegetical parodies and allegorical figures, including the personified figures of Rabbi Idler, or sort of laziness, and Rabbi Miser, or miserliness. In Sefer Habakuk, Gersonides also describes the Provençal Jews' customs of electing a king of Purim to act as master of ceremonies for the communal celebration of the holiday. And Israel Davidson makes it clear that this custom among the Jews is adopted from the Christian carnival feast, a feast of fools. So you can see where I'm going as I'm getting toward Carnal y Quaresma. The close identification of the Persian court as depicted in Megillat Esther and the contemporary realities of Jews serving in the courts of Iberia led to another phenomenon, the celebration of so-called second Purims, commemorating an event in the local area that in some way resembled the treatment of the minority Jewish community as depicted in the narrative of Esther. A second Purim was celebrated in Castile and Zaragoza from, in the case of Castile, at least the 13th century to the expulsion. That of Castile merits special mention because it dates from Juan Ruiz's lifetime, whoever, or lifetimes, or anyway. From the time of the Libro de Buen Amor, is my argument, and involved Alfonso Enceno as the de facto Ahasverush, or the Persian king, his favorite Leonor de Guzman in the role of Esther, since she helped prevent the confiscation of the Jews' possessions and their persecution by Gonzalo Martinez, the Haman of the legend. The story is recorded in Ibn Verga Shevat Yehuda, and in it he couches it in allusions to Megillat Esther. The threat of violence, Haman's threat to destroy the Jewish people in Persia, Gonzalo Martinez's desire to seize the property of and then expel the Jews of Castile, and Alfonso V of Aragon's edict to have the Jews of Zaragoza killed, which led to the Purim of Zaragoza, according to Samuel Levy, dominates. So these themes of violence dominate the tale of Esther and its medieval retellings. Purim was often associated with not only the symbolic violence of the biblical narrative or the Purim parodies, but also the real Jewish Christian violence in medieval Iberia and beyond its borders in the rest of Europe. I think I have a picture here. This is from the Arachel Bible, which is a later 15th century, but just to give you an idea, because this is the translation of Esther, and you have the king, and then you have the courtiers, how important this is as a court, the role of courtiers, and then you have Haman hanging, so just the violence, right? This is where the non-Jews are hung, or, avenged, or revenged. The Jews get vengeance upon the non-Jews. Elliot Horowitz's book-length study traces the historical trajectory of how the Carnivalesque celebration of Purim that involves sometimes raucous readings of Megillat Esther, with particular delight in the destruction of Haman and his Persian allies. And in Horowitz's study, he's documented sort of men who would cross-dress and play the roles of Vashti and Esther, and then, there's just a lot of drunkenness, and apparently they were quite lively. But he sort of traces how these celebrations gave rise to a form of black legend, attributing real acts of violence against the Jews: blood libel, consecration of the host, consecration of the cross, or desecration of the host, desecration of the cross, and other instantiations of imagined violence that have proven particularly pernicious, and many of these have survived into modernity, so you can still hear variations. Several of the medieval Iberian and Provençal Purim parodies discussed above exploit the connection between Purim and Passover and couch their satire in the use of allusions to the biblical narrative of Exodus as commemorated in Passover. The holiday of Passover, commemorating the Jews' redemption from Egypt, as also recalled in the beginning lines of the Salamanca manuscript, lasts a week during which Jews eat unleavened bread and hold a special dinner, as most of you I'm sure know, in commemoration of the Jews' travails in the desert as told in Exodus and echoed in subsequent diasporic events. It also records God's punishment of non-Jews, in the case of the Exodus, the Egyptians. There are inherent connections between the Purim tale of Megillat Esther and that of Jewish redemption from Egypt as told in Exodus, events that the author of the Libro de Buen Amor relates, in my opinion, in podcasts 1 and 2 in the Salamanca manuscript. Both narratives tell of events that occur outside of Israel, and both a Jewish leader negotiates within a foreign court to save the Jewish people, and further the events of Purim are said in the biblical text to take place during Passover in the month of Nisan. The Jewish holiday of Passover is also explicitly referred to in the episode of Carnal and Quaresma. Passover, which was called by many Iberian Jews as the Quaresma Judía, often fell on the same days as the Christian festivals of Lent and Easter. And just as Purim served in the Jewish community as a time for reflection on coexistence with non-Jews and anxiety about persecution, Holy Week in medieval Europe was a period during which Christians reflected on imagined Jewish hostility toward their faith. And David Biel notes that Purim often fell during Christian Lent in the Middle Ages. For Christians, celebration of Easter were often explicit in blaming the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus, and subsequently Lent and Easter were often periods of heightened anti-Jewish violence. Such anti-Jewish violence was associated with violence that Christians imagined Jews perpetrating against them. Such imagined anti-Christian violence was attributed to Iberian Jews contemporary with the author of the Libro de Buen Amor. David Nierenberg has studied the case of the early 14th century Zaragozan Jews who were accused of, and I quote, building a tower onto their home so that they could watch services in the neighboring church and of throwing meat bones from it onto the facade of the gallery of the church on Good Friday. So in clerical versions of the 1331 Girona riots, the violence was the result of armed Jews attacking the cathedral and seeking revenge. So this is precisely the Lenten season that forms the context for the ritualized carnivalesque violence narrated in the Libro de Buen Amor in the episode of Carnaval y Quaresma. These two personifications of liturgical and seasonal celebrations are associated in this episode with either dietary restrictions in the case of Quaresma or in the case of Carnaval with the excess associated with this celebration. Their narrative opens just after the protagonist has escaped the monstrous serranas and traversed the sierra and following 2 poems of thanksgiving dedicated to Mary and Jesus for saving him from the serranas. And this is the beginning of the episode. As Felix Lecoy notes, over the course of some 113 verses, we are told how, by way of an epic battle, the troops of Don Carnal, composed of domestic and wild animals, commonly hunted as prey or kept as livestock, are routed by those of Doña Quaresma, whose troops are composed of fish and a few vegetables. From the beginning, Carnal y Quaresma are presented as bellicose forces and leaders, Carnal as an emperor and Quaresma as an alguacil, of their respective comic armies intent on battle. While Quaresma's authority extends only over Christians, and she's clear that she has been sent by Christ to all the clerics,